we're going to start with some threat hunting fundamentals. We're going to talk a little bit about how CrowdStrike does it. But keep in mind, these techniques can be used for any company. And so we think we're pretty good at what we do, but I don't want you to think this is a sales pitch. This is something I think can be applicable to most organizations. Then we're going to take a brief look at PIONEER KITTEN. That's the adversary we're talking about today. Talk about who they are, who they target, and then get into the meat of the actual presentation, which is the intrusion overview or intrusion walkthrough. And that's going to be kind of a step-by-step of what we've seen this actor do in a specific intrusion. And the final piece is, yeah, that's great. What do we do about it? So that's going to be the recommendation piece of this. So let's go ahead and get started. So once again, this is going to be a little bit about how we do it and why we do it. First up, why is it necessary? Why is threat hunting a piece that should be fundamental to organizations' defense portfolio? And realistically, it comes down to a couple of different things. As Garrett said in the previous talk, we have access brokers as well as spear phishing becoming bigger and bigger threats. And so no longer are people having to find ways to get into your environment that would trigger perimeter controls. Now they have keys to the front door. And so you need somebody looking on the other side of that door and finding those indicators that they're already in the system. The other piece is we see a lot of them using native tools. This intrusion doesn't have a single piece of software pulled down from the internet or brought with the attackers. This is all using native binaries within the Windows system. This is a trend we're seeing time and time again, and it makes them a lot sneakier. You're no longer matching on hashes or those file downloads. And so this is why we do it. A little bit about the different ways we go about it. The first piece is going to be your statistical analysis. And so that's, hey, what's weird in my environment? Now, we have a bit of a leg up here on this, to be fair. We got a lot of environments, but even within a single organization's environment, you should be looking for those outliers, right? You need to find what programs are people running, what scheduled tasks are there, what's strange. And so that's where we start. We also do some retrospective analysis. We'll talk about this a little bit later. That's going to be great. We found a new technique. Wait a second. We weren't looking for that. Let's go do that now, right? And so as we discover new things, let's apply that to our previous data sets. And the last piece is hypothesis testing. And so this is really the human side of this, where you're thinking, well, I've seen this binary be renamed, but it has this interesting flag. I wonder if I can go find other renamed binaries using this same unique flag. And so that's kind of like I wonder if, and then following that up. So this is our high level strategies, but let's talk about what a good threat hunting process looks like. And so the first step of this is going to be, and let me take one step back. We use the acronym SEARCH here to describe this process. Once again, I don't want people walking away from this thinking this isn't applicable to your organizations. And so while this is specifically CrowdStrike language, these concepts still apply. So the first step is going to be sense. And at this point, we're just gathering telemetry. We're not passing any judgment on it. And that telemetry has all different kinds of elements to it. That could be processes that are being ran, DNS request, could be scheduled task. And from CrowdStrike's perspective, this is all endpoint focused. But if you're doing network detection, it needs to be network focused. What connections are being reached out, the duration, those pieces of information. The next step is we need to enrich this. For somebody to find some use out of this, we need to start applying some properties to these. So where is that DNS request reaching out to? What is that process that's being ran? What is the scheduled task, right? And so what happens is we end up with what we call threat hunting leads. And these are things that we know are a little suspicious, but there's no way we could send these to a SOC. We can't be alerting customers or getting the incident response team brought up on this for every single one of these, because they're a lot looser than your typical detections, right? These are commands like who am I being ran. These are sometimes account creations. And so what we look for is we look for clusters of this information operating on a single host or that are related in some way. And so that's this next stage is analyze. We start clustering this and we say, great, we have these hunting leads that we know can sometimes be malicious. What other pieces of telemetry have we gathered? And are those malicious as well, right? What about those? Let's dive into those a little bit deeper. And I want to point out here, we gather all of this without any judgment. And that's, in my opinion, the best way to do it, because if there's anyone in this room that can look at a bunch of telemetry and immediately make a judgment call on if it's good or bad and be 100% right, please come let me know. We want to hire you, right? And so you need to be gathering all that so that way you can analyze it after the fact. Next is we're reconstructing, right? We're taking a look at the attacker did step 1, 2, 3, 4. And what that usually leads to is actually new detections being made. You see them up here in the blue. And we say, oh, we didn't know this technique existed. Or there's a variation on an existing technique. And so now we've expanded what we know a little bit. And I'll be honest, this next step, communicate, this is why we do it. Whether you're an internal threat hunting team that's providing this feedback to your IR team, or your CrowdStrike and you're providing it to clients, you need to isolate that intrusion and somehow package it up and make sure that it gets to the right stakeholders, right, at the end of the day. Now, once again, this is why we do it, but to be better at this step, we need to also hone this. And so we found these new hunting leads. Maybe we turn these into existing ones, and then there's that retrospective analysis. We apply it to other pieces of telemetry and start to find additional intrusions that we wouldn't have otherwise found. So this is the threat hunting methodology. And once again, this is what our Overwatch team does. A traditional threat hunting team would do the same thing. And the output of this team is communication. So speed is important. Brevity is important in those reports in terms of what mitigations need to be done next. I don't work on the Overwatch team. I work on a fun team that sits in between that communicate and hone stage. So my team is the tactical intrusion research team. And what we do is we do post-mortem analysis on intrusions that have been found. And so the way I usually explain it is, the hunters are finding the needles in the haystack, and then they're just handing us piles of needles. And so from an exposure perspective, it's pretty cool. I get a great signal to noise ratio on what I get to look at. And this presentation is a direct result of being in the middle of that process. So a brief bit about Pioneer Kitten. First of all, Garrett once again mentioned this. I'm going to keep referencing him because he had a lot of good points. Adversary attribution is actually really difficult. It becomes really fuzzy. And so there's two pieces of this that become important. You have your atomic indicators that are things like IP addresses and domains. Those can be easily faked. Those can be easily subverted, right? If we think about the pyramid of pain, those are easy for an adversary to swap out. On the other side, though, these behavioral indicators are actually way more interesting, a little bit more nuanced as well, because not only are we looking at techniques and tools, right? Normally, I'd do a raise of hands here, but I'm going to make the assumption that in this room, we've had a lot of people go to different classes for either blue team or red team tools. You invested time, you invested money to learn those techniques. And if somebody said, well, yeah, great, I need you to do the same task you've been doing, but I need you to use a different tool, there'd be a substantial investment required for you to pick up an alternative tool. And the same thing is true for our adversaries. And so figuring out what techniques they use and what tools they're using on a regular basis can help kind of cluster that activity around an actor. The next thing up is command flags. You'd be surprised. A lot of these companies, I say companies, criminal organizations like Conti have run books. And so sometimes those operators are not actually as skilled as we may think. And so when they see netstat-NAO, they are always going to run the -NAO in that order. And so depending on what order those flags are in, or what types of flags, right? Maybe they're using a dash and then a word, we can start to get those patterns down. The one that I love is command mistakes. We actually have some tracking that looks at, hey, who's trying to run a interpreter command inside of a normal shell? That tells us that whatever group this is used to running interpreter. And so there's all these little pieces that help identify that. So specifically though today, now keep in mind, please don't ask me a ton of attribution questions. I'm not on the Intel team. I do get this information and we can use this to hunt deeper. But today we're gonna be looking at Pioneer Kitten. Pioneer Kitten is an Iranian threat actor. And ideally they're targeting IP, R&D, they're looking for information. So, very different than Conti. Their motivation was clearly financial. This team is targeting countries all over the world, quite frankly, but mainly, the U.S., Israel, and then some other Middle East countries. Maybe that's a little bit more politically motivated. They're targeting industries such as government, healthcare, technology, and defense, and all of those are surrounded and focused on because of the information they have, not necessarily the money they have, right? So, a few caveats here. First things first, I'm not up here to rebuild a play-by-play, second-by-second of this intrusion. I'm here to focus on the techniques that they use, and so that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be jumping and kind of clustering those in ways that make sense logically. The other thing is, I'm not too interested if whether it's Falcon or whatever technique was blocked maybe by Windows. That's less relevant to me as well, because these are techniques that are being attempted. Everyone's organization is going to be different. Your controls are going to be different. And so I want to let you know what's being used out there in the wild. That's whether it impacted this particular client, negatively or not, is irrelevant to everyone in this room. So, and the last piece is obviously we've redacted some information. So anytime you see something in blue, that is an indication that's been replaced. I didn't want to put big old redacted things. It doesn't make those commands look super great and may confuse some people on where to look for some of these files. So let's dive in. First up, now, I should have learned from Garrett, these should be a little bit larger. Good news, I don't need you to read these commands or their output. What we see here is we see an adversary running some discovery commands. Net user, they found a user, and then they went net user and actually pulled information specifically about a single user. Now, this seems super basic, and it is. So why is it in the slide deck? Well, you'd be shocked about how many adversaries land on a box and immediately start running discovery commands. Whether that's netstat, who am I, net group, net user, it is something we see almost universally across all of our intrusions. And so I don't want to underplay this. This is a very important piece. And think about what users in your organization are also running these commands. Maybe admins. Your guy in accounting shouldn't be running who am I? He probably doesn't even know what that is, right? And so keep an eye on your discovery commands. We saw a few others. We saw netstat being ran, which is going to pull live connections. And that tells an organization a little bit about where services may be running on other boxes, where other hosts may be, or what services are running locally. And the last piece is queue user. This will come in important in a bit. This is a query user command, and this lets them know who's actively connected to the box. And so that'll be relevant here in a bit. Next, we saw some pretty basic persistence. So we saw an account creation, and then that account immediately got added to local administrators. Once again, nothing crazy here. That's going to be a running theme throughout this. We will get into some more technical and more interesting things, but at no point was I like, yeah, they went from this box to this box using magic. These adversaries are limited by the same TCP/IP stacks and operating systems as we are. And so a little bit of this is to demystify what they're using, right? Sure, are there more advanced versions of these techniques? Yeah, absolutely. But a lot of the time we're seeing some garden variety stuff, even from nation state actors. So a little bit more interesting piece here for the persistence is they used a web shell. Now, something interesting, depending on how an EDR agent or how you're collecting things from a host is working, if they RDP into a box, you may actually not see the commands ran because they're not using a CMD, they're not using a terminal. They may be clicking through Windows. And so all these previous ones, the net user, the account creation, all that was done using command line, and all of it was captured very clearly. What if they just click on something? How do we track that? And so this is not a forensics course, this is not a forensics talk, so we're not going to dive super deep into this. But I'm going to convince you by the end of this talk that Windows is spying on you, and we can use that to our advantage. So over here, I have what I consider a mini start menu. And so when you right click on an application, it'll show you what you've opened recently with that. Super convenient. Anytime there's any of that convenience built in, inherently, we all know in this room that Windows must be tracking that somewhere. And so this is called a jump list. And this is kind of interesting because they don't make it super obvious what jump list is associated with what application. But this string up here, this hideous string, equates to Notepad. Now, how do we know that? There are people who have put in a lot more dedication, a lot more time than I have, and they've gone through and they've identified over 500 different applications and what jump lists are associated with those. I've got the site down here. Now, of course, that's unreadable for those of you in the back, and then probably not useful for anyone wanting to jot it down. But those jump list indexes exist, and it's super useful if you're wanting to kind of step back into something here. So what we know from this slide is that they open Notepad. That doesn't necessarily mean that they created a local web shell, but now we have link files. Link files are just shortcut files. And anytime you see anything inside of the recent files section in your Explorer, you can actually navigate there. You can go to your app data, roaming, Microsoft Windows, recent, and you can see what files have recently been accessed. Matter of fact, I have what now seems to be a very small GIF kind of showcasing this. I'm opening things using the GUI, and we're seeing them populate here. We're not seeing it well, but that's okay. And we also see a jump list being created here. And as a result, now we can leverage that. And so keep in mind, anytime there's Microsoft knows what you want to do, whether that's from a performance perspective or a convenience perspective, that's probably documented somewhere. So they created a web shell. That's interesting on the local box, right? But then we start to see remote web shell creation. And this is something that, I'll be honest, I wasn't aware that you could do. You can run Notepad followed by a UNC path, and you can just write a file. It opens up Notepad right on your machine. You're modifying it, you save it, and boom, it goes over to the other file. Pretty slick, logical, right? I'm not surprised by this. I just had never done it. And so they did that across multiple machines, I think 5 in total, impacting multiple ASPX files, which are related to, in this case, an ISS server. So, of course, they've modified configuration files. Now they need to restart the service. And so I'm not going to go into this slide and how ugly this is, but the things you need to know is there's a task creation, a task ran, and a task deletion. Now, if we make that a little bit easier to read, we can see in here that they created something called server managements with an S. Not sure why they thought that was super stealthy. The schedule, they're going to run it once, and the command is ISS restart. Is really what it is. They're resetting that server. They have remote systems. They have the admin credentials. In this case, it's a fill-in, but they have some user credentials, and they want to run it as system. And the start time is 6 o'clock. So now we think, great, now we just wait. Well, no. They created it, and then they ran a command to run it, and then they deleted it. And so it's really just a way to execute a command on another machine. So if this is, I think, an important piece here. Now, they waited 27 minutes between the file modification and the scheduled task creation. The piece here is that if you're running periodic queries on your scheduled task, you may think that you're able to find anything related to scheduled task. But if you're running it at 5-minute intervals, there's a pretty good chance you actually missed this one. It was only alive for about a minute. God forbid you're doing every 30 minutes. And so those types of defenses work great against long-term persistence if they're wanting to reestablish a shell. But in this case, you probably missed it because it was just up for a second to execute something. Oh, by the way, we switched from persistence to lateral movement because it's complicated. It's complicated when you start bucketizing things, but it's that same technique they use for persistence. Now they're moving laterally and able to get those web shells on other boxes. So this is an interesting one. This is interesting because I was 100% wrong about what I thought it did. This is a registry key along the top, and it's for terminal services. And the value is, or I'm sorry, the key is shadow. And you can actually set this shadow value to 1 or 0 through 4. So you have 5 options. And it equates to, going through the system and actually modifying. My spotlight's not working, but on the right-hand side, you see the GUI version of that. It allows you to say, hey, when I shadow a session, either I can full out deny remote control, I can obtain the user permission to view or edit, or I can just bypass that and don't ask for anything. And that's absolutely what they did. They set it to 2. Now, when I went to go test this, I said, great, this is for RDP. Completely ignoring the fact that it's a shadow value. I was like, great, this is for RDP. And I tested that out, and there's a prompt for that. But this specifically is to piggyback off of existing RDP connections, right? Shadowing sessions that are already existing. And so that's why that queue user was important. They can see what sessions exist. Little flow chart here. So that would allow an adversary to run this MSTSC, which is used for RDP. They can run the shadow command. They can, and this is the session that they're actually wanting to shadow. They're wanting to control versus view it. And the last piece is the no consent prompt. Now you may think that should be enough. If they run that, there's probably still going to be a prompt depending on the settings of that machine that they're wanting to remote into. And then it's up to the admin or the user on that box to say, yes, I want to allow this, or no, I don't. And so if they say no, you get kicked right out. If they say yes, great, you have that shadow session established. Once you set that registry key, you're bypassing that entirely and you're shadowing immediately. And so that's where these things become a little bit spooky. Next one up, once again, Windows is spying on you. So anytime you click on a dropdown and you say, great, these are things that I've used, this is useful, that's stored somewhere. And in a lot of cases, it's beneficial for us to be able to go look at those and pull that information. But a little bit more advanced adversaries are starting to clear these out as they move throughout an environment. And that's exactly what happened here. You can see in the top right or top left, a delete command for this registry key, terminal servers, server client, servers, and default. So if we look over here on the right-hand side, it's fairly illegible. You'll just have to take my word for it. But under terminal server client, we see the IPs listed here that are the same in the dropdown. We can see a GIF here of clearing those out and what actually happens. And so we see a lot of adversaries starting to clean up after themselves, especially in the better known registry keys, such as something like this. We'll see that closed and it opens back up. Fun fact, we still have at least one value in there, and I don't know where that's stored. So that's a little bit more research for me to figure out. I expected this to be a lot cleaner, but all those drop downs are gone. So that's still stored somewhere. More work is required there. Next thing, this is a fun one. WDigest has been used in the past by adversaries because when a user would log in, they would store credentials in clear text. And obviously that's not good for a lot of reasons. It would store them in clear text in memory. And so around 2014, Windows said, great, we've got to fix this. This is a problem. And they removed that registry key. But in 2022, as I stand on this stage right now, if you go create that registry key and set it to use logon credential, it actually re-enables this. And so it's kind of interesting that like their patch was just like, we'll get rid of it and like nobody will think to add it back. But I mean, like that's the technological debt that Windows also has to work through, right? They have systems that rely on registry keys that have been around for ages, right? And it's built stacks on stacks on stacks. So what do we see them do originally is they query this WDigest and they try to find the string use logon credential. And this is a screenshot from my machine, but I have a feeling this is what the adversary saw, because if they didn't find that use logon credential as a value, they probably added it. And that's exactly what they did. Now, this is a bad example because I think I copied and pasted. This should say add, and they added the use logon credential. And so what does that do for them when they add that? Now, we didn't see Mimikatz ran. We didn't see any indication that the LSS process was pulled or any other kind of credential pulls. But think about that. It stores credentials in clear text. It doesn't convert existing sessions credentials into memory. You have to wait until somebody else logs in. And so this shows us a little bit about intent. This shows that they're probably going to lie low for a little bit, wait for some people to log in. Maybe that's incident responders with domain credentials, right? And pull those credentials out. And so, of course, I'm not as talented on Red Team as many of our adversaries. And so I just installed Mimikatz and disabled a bunch of stuff. And when I ran it before, the password was null. And when I pulled WDigest, after I set that registry key, we see the password in plain text there. And so there's not even any cracking that needs to be done there. So with all that said, what do we do about all that? We break down everything we saw. There's really four things that concern me here. I left out the web shell creation. It's really hard to be like, I'm going to audit every time somebody changes a text file. Like that's kind of tough. But we can look at account creations, discovery commands, schedule task, and registry keys, registry changes. those are all valid things that I think we can get a handle on as a community, right? This may be a little bit small to see, but I've put some data sources you're going to need to be able to do anything with these. Not an extensive list. I'm sure there are some interesting, first of all, registry keys that I've missed from a blue team perspective, but a lot of these are some fairly low-hanging fruit to gather. Some companies don't have EDR, and so you have Windows Event IDs that'll cover most of the stuff that we need to look at. But ideally, you'd want to get that EDR telemetry, because now you're not worried about audit policies. You're not worried about forwarding logs. You're not worried about any of those queuing services a lot of the time. And if you're gathering that host telemetry, you want to look at command lines, scheduled tasks, created users, and then users being added to tasks, right? Now, can't look at all of those, so we'll go over some techniques and some methods to look at that. And then last but not least, querying live hosts, right? You need some way to do that to find existing scheduled tasks, existing registry keys. So first up, account creations. You got to figure out how accounts are created in your environment, right? It's one thing to go by a set of benchmarks and say, it should happen this way, and that's it. Guess what? If you have some automated system to create users and it's handed from one service account over to another, and all of a sudden you have an account at the end of this magical pipeline that the DevOps have created, you probably can't use the same audit policy as somebody who, Bob admin down the hallway is creating users. So you need to figure out what that path looks like for your users and find deviations from that. So find out when that service account isn't the one that created that user. Now, this last one, this seems silly. I'll be honest. This last bullet is investigate account creations during off work hours. I don't know about you. I don't have that many off work hours. I'm always working in some regard, but then you have people around the world. My team is split up over the UK and Australia. And so just our team alone, there's no such thing as normal working hours. You'd have to go admin by admin and kind of set those parameters. So a little bit more difficult to do now that we're post-COVID. Discovery commands. If I were moving into an environment right now, and I wanted to say, man, I would really like to make sure that we're catching adversaries that are getting through our perimeter. I'll be honest, this is where I would start. I would build a handful of rules looking for basic discovery commands, and I would batch those together under some category. I would look for hosts that have those firing more than 3 or 4 times. Now, once again, you're inevitably going to come across something that is, a scheduled task or something that your IT staff has put in place to make sure something exists before they run another piece of automation. Exclude those. But I want to see where this is happening more 3 or 4 times. Odds are you're going to catch a lot of admins logging into servers, making sure they are who they say they are, making sure they have the connections, troubleshooting. But I'm telling you, when an adversary hits a box, they're running these commands to figure out where they're at and where they can go. Scheduled tasks. This is a bit more fun. And I talked about this a little bit before. Establishing a baseline is important, right? So you're talking about an environment that doesn't have any monitoring. You want to go out and you want to query those hosts. You want to see what's existing. Now, are you going to